Welcome to AP Environmental Science. In this video, we are going to talk a little bit about the phosphorus cycle, and this video corresponds to Module 7 in your textbook. Remember that when we are thinking of biogeochemical cycles, we are thinking of the things that cycle constantly throughout the biosphere. What we're talking about is not anything such as energy, where energy flows into and out of the biosphere. That's not a cycle, that's just a directional movement. In this video, we are focusing in on the phosphorus cycle. A few key pieces about the phosphorus cycle to keep in mind is that phosphorus is required for many biological processes. So it's the main component in your DNA, in your RNA, and in the ATP, which is that energy storing molecule that your cells need. Phosphorus is also a limiting nutrient. That means that there's not enough of it in the environment for plant growth to take place as much as it wants. There's only so much, and that usually limits how much plants can grow and how much life can exist in a particular location. So a lot of fertilizers actually are adding phosphorus into the soil so that way plants can continue to grow more than they normally would. Also, keep in mind that there is not an atmospheric component to the phosphorus cycle. So if you ever see a diagram of a nutrient cycle and there is absolutely no arrows going to or from the atmosphere, then you know right off the bat that that is the phosphorus cycle. You don't need to know anything else about the diagram. If there's no atmosphere, that means it's the phosphorus cycle. Also, keep in mind that this is a super slow process, and phosphorus actually very rarely changes form, and typically it's found as a phosphate, so PO4 3-. There are several key processes to the phosphorus cycle. The biotic processes include assimilation and mineralization. Assimilation happens when producers, which are plants, incorporate phosphorus from the soil into their tissues. Assimilation also takes place when animals come in and eat those plants and assimilate or incorporate the phosphorus from their food into their own body tissues. Mineralization is kind of the opposite of that. It is when an organism dies. As that organism decomposes, that phosphorus is then converted back into the inorganic phosphate in the soils. The abiotic or non-living processes have a lot to do with the rock cycle. These include sedimentation. So if you think back to your chemistry classes, phosphorus is not very soluble, so it forms a precipitate or a solid when it's put into certain types of solution. And that precipitate will start to accumulate on the bottom, particularly of the ocean, and it'll form sedimentary rocks. Geologic uplift, again, rock cycle type process. This is a very slow process where sediments using tectonic plates are pushed up near the surface to form mountains. Weathering is when the rocks are kind of broken down and slowly eroded away. But make a note that since phosphorus is not very soluble, very little of that phosphorus actually leaches out of the soil to then move into aquatic or water bodies. This makes phosphorus a limiting nutrient in aquatic ecosystems. So this is really important to make a note of. We can look at a diagram here of the phosphorus cycle. You can see a lot of these terms that I was talking about on here. Just know I'm not going to ever ask you to label a diagram like this, but if it helps you to visualize what these processes are, then great. Humans do impact the phosphorus cycle, and they impact it pretty significantly because phosphorus is normally a limiting nutrient. That means normally there's not enough phosphorus. But human activities such as mining or using artificial fertilizer and using detergents, they all can lead to a sudden influx or excess phosphorus. And this can lead to a whole bunch of new plant growth. But what happens is if this excess phosphorus gets into a waterway, we can have what's called eutrophication. Now, the term eutrophication comes up constantly throughout this course, and it's really important that you understand the process. So what happens here is you have an excess amount of phosphorus or nutrients are added to an aquatic environment. And this causes a sudden burst of plant growth, particularly in the form of algae. Now, these algae keep growing as fast as they can, and they use up all of that extra nutrients. But now that they don't have enough to be able to sustain themselves, they all start to die off pretty quickly. And when the algae bloom dies, then microbes come in and they start to decompose the now dead algae. And as microbes do the process of decomposition, they use up a lot of the oxygen that is in that aquatic environment. So if we think about how fish and other aquatic organisms survive, they actually breathe the dissolved oxygen in the water. So if these bacteria are using all of that dissolved oxygen, that means we're suddenly going to have a significant decrease in the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water. And that's really bad because all of the other organisms that rely and use that dissolved oxygen, now they're suffocating. So we'll suddenly see another large die-off in fish and other aquatic organisms. So in summary, key takeaways from this particular biogeochemical cycle is that phosphorus is a very slow process, and most of the reservoirs hold phosphorus compounds for relatively long periods of time, especially when you compare it to the other cycles. Also, make sure that you understand why phosphorus is a limiting nutrient in most ecosystems and what can happen when you have excess phosphorus, which leads to eutrophication. As always, please send me your questions, thoughts, reaction, feedback, and I hope that as you watch this video, you were able to learn something.